Hello, my name is Harzing and I'm a professor of international management, staff development lead and research mentor at Middlesex University Business School. This recording is part of a set of 6 which make up the preparation for Middlesex University Writing Bootcamp. Although we're open to papers targeted at any stage of development in the bootcamp and targeted at any journal, we focus in particular on writing for top journals that desk reject a large proportion of their submissions without even sending the paper out for reviews. Our aim is thus to ensure that your paper has the best possible chance of getting into the peer review process. The first session consists of an introduction to the bootcamp and the development of the publishing landscape. In the second session, we then explain how to craft a descriptive and memorable title. In the third session, we explain how to write polished abstracts that include all relevant information and guide the editor towards choosing the best possible reviewers for your paper. The fourth session deals with the introduction of the paper and explains its crucial role in positioning the paper in the scholarly landscape that you're trying to contribute to. Session 5 then deals with the concluding section of your paper and outlines how important it is to end on a high note. We also discuss the strategic role of referencing in this session. In the 6th and final session, we talk about the importance of writing a good letter to the editor, having your paper proofread, and about all the other little things you can do to give your paper the best possible chance of surviving the desk reject process. So, for those of you who are more visually oriented, here is an overview of the 6 sessions on just one slide. Last session already, day 3, session 2. Letter to the editor and sharing of experiences. As a general tip, many slides have a URL in the bottom part of the slide that you can look at for further information. This one is the blog post that I wrote up about last year's writing bootcamp. So, well done if you've been watching the 5 previous recordings for the writing bootcamp. This is the recording for the 6th and last session of the writing bootcamp. And here we will talk about the importance of writing a good letter to the editor. So you finish your paper, you're about to submit, but you're not quite finished yet. You need to write a good letter to the editor. We also talk about proofreading and all of the other little things you can do and probably should do to give your paper the best possible chance of getting through a desk reject. Now, before we start talking about writing a letter to the editor, let's talk a little bit more about editors and reviewers in general. You will find that some journals allow you to pick your own associate editor. This is not the case in all journals, but journals that get a lot of submissions typically have an elaborate editorial structure. So they might have 1 or 2 editors-in-chief, but then they have a whole series of associate editors focusing on slightly different areas of content that are published in the journal. So really look at that list of associate editors carefully and see which one you think would be most appreciative of the content of your paper in terms of the topic, but also in terms of the research method you use. So have a look at what the associate editors have published. In some cases you might already know the associate editor by name because you've read some of their work, but if they're not familiar, do a little bit of work and figure out what they have published and where. And you can use the free Publish or Perish software to look up all of the editors and associate editors and simply compare them. Now, some journals also allow you in the online submission system to suggest reviewers for your papers. Not all journals do, but even if they don't, you can still include those in the letter you write to the editor. So if you do give reviewer suggestions, and I strongly recommend you do, make sure that they are not your co-authors, friends, or anyone else who might have a conflict of interest. First of all, doing so is not ethical and is in fact a questionable research practice. However, there is an even bigger risk if you do so and your co-authors and friends are ethical or more ethical than you are. They will tell the editor, I'm sorry, I can't actually review this article because I've co-authored with this paper, or they're a good friend, or they work in the same institution. And then the editor thinks, oh my God, this author is trying to cheat the system. So they will instantly desk reject your paper. So even if you are tempted to do this, which you shouldn't be, don't. So the editor will generally use at least one of your suggestions, but I suggest that you name at least 3 or 4 reviewers, but if you can find 5 or 6, that's ideal, because remember, good reviewers are in high demand, so they get lots of reviewing requests and they might actually diffuse most of them. I normally try to pick at least half of the reviewers from the editorial board, because editorial board members obviously are committed to review for the journal and are more likely to say yes to reviewing for the journal. They're also more likely to be familiar with the journal format, so they're likely to be good reviewers. If you've chosen a set of reviewers, do the same kind of due diligence that you do for the associate editor, the acting editor for your paper. Check whether your reviewers have published in your field, and if they have, make sure that you reference their work, that you cite their work if appropriate. Don't just cite it for the sake of it to flatter them or bribe them into accepting your paper. They will see easily through that. Don't do that, but do reference their work if it's relevant for your paper. This might all seem like it's a huge amount of work. Yes, it might be. It might well easily be a few hours of work. I've seen some colleagues say, I'm not going to bother. Selecting reviewers is the editor's job. Well, I think that's a complete miscalculation, because the editor is a very busy person, far busier than you are, and they appreciate all the help they can get. But even more importantly, you know your paper. You know who the best reviewers for this paper would be. You know who would appreciate reading this paper. So why not give your paper a better chance and identify those reviewers that you think will give your paper the best chance? So now, the letter to the editor. Most online submission systems will give you the opportunity to either include a letter in a specific box or attach a separate letter to the editor. And it's not compulsory, but I would highly recommend that you do so. And don't write this in a hurry whilst you're submitting the system and then just type a few lines in the box. No, think about it carefully. So explain in the letter why you decided to submit your manuscript to this particular journal. How does it fit in the conversation that is going on in that particular journal? Why is it worth the editor's time to consider it? So clearly outline how the paper is of interest to readers of that journal. Why would they want to read it? What are the strengths of your paper? What are its main contributions? And if you've written your abstract carefully and your introduction and conclusion carefully, you will already have a lot of the sentences that you can use in the letter as well. If you have a particular research site, a particular sample, a particular method that is interesting or particularly relevant for the journal, then outline that in the letter as well. Draw out as many possible reasons for the editor to like your paper. As I said, if the online online submission system doesn't have a separate space to nominate reviewers, you can put your reviewers in the letter, and you can also explain why you think they are good reviewers, because they know a lot about the topic area, because they're an expert in a particular method, because they know the country you're studying very well. Just explain a little bit why you're suggesting these reviewers. Most of all, though, treat the editor like you would like to be treated yourself. Treat them with respect. Remember, the editor is an academic just like you, but they're much, much busier than you. Being an editor of a major journal can easily take you 2 or even 3 days a week. If you're an associate editor, it will take you half a day, a week. They're doing this work voluntarily. They're not getting paid for it. They're usually not getting any teaching relief or relief of other duties for it from their own institution. So they're doing this purely as a service to the academic community. So treat them with respect and make their work easy. Make their life easier, not more difficult. And you might not really believe this, but an editor can be your best friend. Editors want to accept papers. They want exciting papers in their journal. They want to showcase that journal and show the world that it's making a great contribution to the field. But you need to make them excited about your paper. You need to make them understand why your paper would be a great contribution to their journal. So we're now at the end of what has been a fairly long journey of 7 steps that might help to avoid a desk reject for your paper. In step 1, we talked about the importance of seeing journals as communities where academic conversations about particular topics are going on. So the importance of picking the right journal for your paper. Then in step 2, we looked at the title. In step 3, we looked at the abstract. In step 4, we looked at the introduction. In step 5, we looked at the conclusion. In step 6, we looked at how you can use referencing strategically throughout your paper. And in step 7, we looked at how to write a good letter to the editor. There are 2 additional steps, steps 8 and 9, that might help to make a difference between accepting your paper for the review process and desk rejecting your paper. The first step, step 8, is language editing. We need to realize that very, very few of us are blessed with being natural writers. I'm certainly not. And every paper benefits from a language edit. And this is true for native English speakers just as much as it is for non-native English speakers. A good editor improves your English, clarifies your writing, and clarifies your thought process. If you are a non-native English speaker, though, language editor is not just a choice, it's essential depending on your level of English language skill. English is a relatively simple language to speak, much simpler than many other languages, but it's a really difficult language to write correctly, even for some native speakers, as some of you will have noticed. So the only way to learn how to use English more effectively is to read a lot. And also write a lot, but also try to learn actively while writing. And a good editor can help you to learn how to write more effectively. So in the blog post I've referenced at the bottom of this slide, there is a session with some details and a presentation about editing that you might find interesting. Now, this slide is by no means a comprehensive illustration of the problems that you can encounter if you have to write in English as a non-native speaker. However, there are a few very common problems that you will start to recognize if you write with co-authors with a particular language background. For instance, there are many languages that do not have articles, or they do not differentiate between definite and indefinite articles. Unfortunately, the distinction between the two is pretty crucial in academic writing. Then tenses. There are many languages that have fewer tenses than English, East Asian, for instance. East Asian languages, for instance. And unfortunately, the distinction between tenses is quite crucial in academic writing. It's quite important whether something happened in the past, in the present, or in the future. Then the word order in a sentence in English is very different from many other languages in terms of whether the subject comes before the verb or the reverse. And this is true even for very similar languages, from similar language families like German and Dutch. So if you read an English sentence written by a German or a Dutch academic, a native English speaker or someone with really good English language skills will feel this doesn't really scan right. And that doesn't matter if it's an email. It doesn't matter even if it's an internal memo. But if it's an academic article and it happens again and again and again, if your article is reviewed by someone with good English language skill or a native speaker, they will invariably end up not having the best possible impression of your article. Then punctuation is really, really important in any language, but in English in particular. And German academics in particular always seem to put the comma in the wrong place. So sometimes they end up saying the opposite of what they really mean. And then finally, in terms of vocabulary, English has a really rich vocabulary. They have many, many different words for almost the same concept. And part of that is because they've imported a lot from French, from German, from Scandinavian languages. So for one particular concept, there might be 4 or 5 different words at least. And for some, there might be 20 or 30. And they all have a subtly different meaning. So when you're writing, try to get into the habit of using the thesaurus that you will find in Word or any other word processing program that you're using, to get more of a feel for how to use different variations on the same theme. And again, reading a lot is really useful to broaden your vocabulary. Now, in this 9th and final step, I will talk about a few other things that I think you can do and in some cases probably should do to improve your chances of your paper getting through the desk reject phase. First of all, I would say get your name or your work known. It might just tip the balance between the binary decision of no, we're going to desk reject this paper, and yes, we're going to put this paper in the review process. To be honest, this is probably more important at the revise and resubmit stage. So that's when your paper has been in the review process. The editor has 2 or 3 or 4 reviews and need to decide whether they're going to reject the paper or whether they're going to allow you to revise and resubmit it. But it might also help in the desk reject process. And to clarify this, I'm by no means saying that if you're a famous academic, you'll have an easy time publishing in journals. Any academic, however famous they are, even if they are Nobel Prize winners, they will get their papers rejected. They might have a slightly higher hit rate in getting to the right journal because they have more experience, but they still get their papers rejected. What I'm saying is that if an editor knows you, has seen you present at conferences, has seen you present competently with passion about your research, or has read your work in other outlets, maybe even just a blog post or a newspaper article. They know that you're an expert in the field, that you're really committed to this field. So they have a better feeling about giving you the chance to get your paper in the review process, or to give you a revise and resubmit. And again, it's not going to get your paper accepted. The editor will still make the decisions based on quality only, but it might just tip the balance in the earlier phases of the review process. So you can do this by presenting at conferences. You can also do this by using social media strategically. And the blog post that I've mentioned at the bottom of this slide gives you some ideas on how you can use social media to improve the impact of your research. And this focuses mostly on research that has already been published, but this is also how you build up a name in the field. Then the second suggestion might sound equally controversial, and again, I'm not saying that you ask senior academics as co-authors on your paper just because you're famous and because the editor will give you an easier time if you have a famous co-author. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying ask senior academics who have published in the journal to join you as co-authors, because they have successfully targeted that journal before. They know what is expected in that journal. And even though their input in the actual writing might only be 10% or 5% of the entire paper, it might actually be the 5 or 10% that makes a difference between, yes, we're going to put this in the review process, or yes, we're going to give this paper a revise and resubmit. And remember, they will also help you in the revise and resubmit process by interpreting the reviewer's comments, because they simply have more experience. Senior academics, depending on the field, might have submitted hundreds of papers to journals. Remember, they might only have published, say, 50 or 100 papers, but they will have submitted to at least double the number of journals, because their papers get rejected and even desk rejected as well. The one thing you absolutely shouldn't do is list a senior author on a paper, senior co-author on a paper, if they don't contribute to the writing or developing the paper in any way. That's an absolute no-no. Last step. Before submission, I would always recommend you, especially if you submit to a journal with a very high desk reject rate, to get a friendly reviewer. A friendly reviewer is someone who gives you the same kind of feedback that reviewers do, so writes up a formal review, but is really someone who's on your side. So that's why we call them a friendly reviewer. It's not to say that normal journal reviewers are unfriendly, but they're not necessarily on your side. So you're asking maybe a colleague in the same field or who has published in the same journal, or you're asking someone that you've met at a conference who you know is working in the same field. But you do need good networks to achieve this, because you're asking a big favor of someone. They just read your paper, give you feedback on how they think it will be received in the journal. That might take up half a day of their time. So you also need to be willing to return the favor if someone asks you to do this. And remember, you don't always have to ask senior academics to do this. It's not that professors have all the wisdom in the world. You can ask your peers as well. And anyone can write an abstract and an introduction. Sometimes you don't need to ask someone to read the entire paper, but you can ask them to read the abstract and the introduction, because as we've discussed in this bootcamp, these are crucial elements in the paper for the editor to decide whether or not to put the paper in the review process, and for the editor to decide which reviewers to pick. So you can ask anyone, say, okay, can you spend maybe half an hour looking at my abstract and introduction and giving me some feedback. Do you think it makes sense? Do you think it's appropriate for this journal? And people who are participating in this bootcamp should be willing to do this for their colleagues as well. And then if you're lucky enough to get to the revise and resubmit stage, and if you haven't published a lot, you might be disappointed if you get a letter from the editor saying this paper needs major revisions. This sounds like it's a really bad paper and it sounds like bad news. No, it's not bad news. It is very, very, very unusual for a paper in a journal in business or economics to be accepted without revisions. It's also very unusual for a paper to be accepted with just minor revisions. Most of the time, and especially in the top journals, you will have major revisions and you will go through at least one round, but in most cases 2, 3 or even 4 rounds of revisions before the paper is finally accepted. So if you do get to the revise and resubmit stage, that's a cause for celebration, because you're one step closer to getting the paper accepted and your chances of final acceptance have increased dramatically. But don't spoil those chances. So when you enter into the revise and resubmit process, write a proper letter responding to the reviewer's concerns one by one, explaining how you have addressed their comments. And try to put yourself in their shoes. Don't try to set them right. Don't tell them, no, you've got this completely wrong and the way I've done it was right. So what are you talking about? You clearly don't understand what I'm talking about. No, if they don't understand something in your paper, you must write it up more clearly. Or maybe you've put it in the wrong place in the manuscript. And I see some authors who are really, really stubborn and they just blame everything on the reviewer and say, well, they're wrong. But if 2 or 3 reviewers and an editor don't understand what you're trying to say, that's a signal. It means that the readers of the paper, other readers of the paper, are not going to understand it either. So take the comments that the reviewers are making in a constructive fashion. Doesn't mean that you have to agree with every single comment. If there is something where you really think they have misunderstood something, then just explain how you've rewritten it to make it clearer. So you don't have to make changes that you're absolutely against, but do take the comments into account. So we're almost at the end of the recording of the 6th and last session of the Writing Bootcamp. And in this session, we've talked about how to write a letter to the editor, but we've also discussed a number of other things that you can do to improve the chances of your paper being accepted. So in the live session that accompanies this section of the bootcamp, we will of course again have a Q&A session about this recording, but we also use it as an opportunity to share our experiences with journal submissions and see whether we can collectively come up with some recommendations for our colleagues. So in the session, don't be shy. The questions you have don't necessarily need to be related to the slides for this session or for any of the other sessions. If you have any other questions about publishing papers, especially publishing papers in journals with high rejection rates, don't feel shy to ask. There are no stupid questions. The only thing that is stupid is not asking questions. And don't forget that the 6th session of the bootcamp is not the end of the process. Your bootcamp mentors and the expert mentors that you have been assigned are there to help you through the coming months, to help you improve your paper and polish your paper. So do feel free to contact them. This is all part of having a supportive and a collaborative research culture at Middlesex University. And if you want to read a little bit more about this, look at the blog post that is referenced at the bottom of this paper. Now, if you're someone who prefers to read rather than listen to presentations like this, I've also written up this presentation in 8 blog posts as part of a series. So as you will see from the titles, they basically cover all of the steps that we also cover in this bootcamp. So if you look at the bottom part of this slide, you will see the URL of the first installment of this blog post. Hooray, you've made it to the end of more than 2 hours of recording in 6 different sections, which are the 6 different sections of the Middlesex University Writing Bootcamp. If you've only captured the last of the 6 recordings, remember that there are 5 earlier recordings and you'll find them easily on YouTube. Remember also that in addition to these recordings, there are an additional 30-odd slides in the slide deck that give you examples of effective abstracts, effective conclusions, and also give you lots of examples of how we have transformed titles in previous bootcamps. And there's also a couple of examples of how we have transformed abstracts in previous bootcamps. So do make sure you check out those examples as well. I hope you enjoyed listening to these recordings. I really look forward to spending the live sessions with you. And in the meantime, I wish you happy writing. And if you are already about to submit to a journal, good luck.